Nessa Cord was rendering fat over a fire she had built in the hollow of a lightning-split oak when she heard Petra coming through the brush 40 minutes before the girl should have been back from the creek. The sound was wrong, too fast, branches breaking rather than bending. Nessa pulled the tin pot off the flames without looking up and set it on the flat stone she used as a shelf, then turned to face the direction of the noise. She was 61 years old and had spent 30 of those years reading the sounds a body made moving through timber. Her granddaughter moved like a careful person. This was not a careful sound. Petra broke through the cedar fringe at a run, her water bucket empty and banging against her knee, her dark hair loose from its braid. She was 14 and tall for it, and with her mother's cheekbones and her grandfather's particular way of setting her jaw when something had gone wrong that she had not yet decided how to explain. "Men on the South Ridge," she said. She was not breathless. The girl had good lungs, but her voice was flat in the way voices go flat when a person is managing something larger than they want to show. "3 of them. Survey stakes. One had a brass instrument on a tripod." Nessa looked at her for a moment, then looked past her toward the South Ridge, where the Palouse Hills rolled down in long grass swells toward the Snake River Valley. The Northern Pacific had been pushing its line through Washington Territory for 2 years. She had known when she filed the claim in the spring of 1881 that the railroad land grants ran checkerboard through this country. Alternate sections, a 1 to the railroad, 1 to settlement, the pattern repeating across the territory like a poorly shuffled deck. She had checked the survey maps in Colfax before she filed. Her section was clean. But survey maps in 1881 were not always what survey maps in 1883 turned out to be. She wiped the fat from her hands onto her canvas apron and looked at the tin pot. She had been rendering the last of the elk tallow she had collected in September, 12 pounds of raw fat from the cow elk Petra had helped her field dress on the upper south slope, boiled down to 8 pounds of clean white tallow that would seal food crocks, waterproof boot leather, and grease the runners on the sled she had built in August. 8 pounds of tallow represented 2 days of careful work and a calculation about how much insulation value she could wring from the coming winter. She did not want to leave it. She left it anyway. She banked the fire with dirt, covered the pot with a flat stone, and picked up the Snyder Enfield carbine she kept propped against the oak's trunk, a single-shot .577 caliber rifle she had carried since her husband Alec died in 1871, heavy and reliable, and not a thing she pointed at people unless she meant it. She slung it over her shoulder with the muzzle down and told Petra to walk behind her and stay quiet. The 3 men on the South Ridge were not railroad workers. They were surveyors, private contractors, from the look of their equipment, working for someone who had hired them rather than for the government directly. Yet the brass theodolite Petra had seen was a girly transit, the same pattern Nessa had watched government surveyors use outside Glasgow in 1849 when she was a girl, and the Highland clearances were still moving through Argyll like a slow fire, pushing families off land their grandparents had worked. She recognized the instrument the way a person recognizes a tool that has been used against them before. The lead man was perhaps 40, with a leather document case strapped across his chest, and the particular confidence of someone carrying papers he believed settled the matter. He saw Nessa coming down the slope and did not step back, which told her he had done this before and expected the conversation to go a specific way. "Mrs. Cord," he said. He knew her name. That meant the papers in that case already had her name on them. "I'm representing the Northern Pacific Land Office out of Spokane Falls. There's been a resurvey of Section 14, Township 18. The original plat contained an error in the baseline measurement. The corrected survey places your filed claim on railroad grant land." Nessa stopped 10 feet from him. She did not unsling the carbine. "Show me the document." He opened the case and produced a folded survey plat, the paper stiff and new, the ink dark and official-looking. She took it from him and read it standing in the October wind on the south ridge of her claim, her granddaughter 6 feet behind her, the grass flattening and rising around their boots in long, slow waves. The document was real. The resurvey was real. The baseline error it described was the kind of error that happened, or was made to happen, when a railroad needed land it had not originally been granted, and had the political machinery to correct surveys in its favor. She had seen this in Scotland. She had not expected to see it again in Washington Territory at the age of 61, but she recognized it with the particular cold recognition of someone encountering a familiar cruelty in an unfamiliar place. She handed the document back. "When? You have 30 days to vacate the claim structure and remove personal property. After 30 days, the land reverts to railroad grant, and any structures become railroad property." 30 days was the 3rd week of November. The first hard frost had already come 2 weeks ago. The Snake River Valley Road to Colfax would be impassable by mid-November in a hard year, and this had the feel of a hard year. The elk had moved early. The creek had skinned ice in the first week of October. The old oak at the north end of the claim had dropped its leaves 2 weeks before the others. She looked at Petra. The girl's jaw was set. Nessa turned back to the surveyor. "I'll need the name of the land office attorney in Spokane Falls." He gave her a card. She put it in her apron pocket. Then she walked back up the slope toward the banked fire and the tin pot of tallow and the oak tree that had been the northern anchor of her claim for 2 years, thinking about 30 days and what a person could build in that time if the building was the right kind. The hollow in the oak faced northeast, which was wrong for warmth and right for everything else. Nessa had noticed the cavity the first week she worked the claim, a fire scar from some old strike that had burned out the heartwood on the lower trunk, leaving an opening roughly 3 feet wide and 4 feet tall. The interior blackened and dry. The wood around it hardened by decades of slow charring into something closer to iron than timber. She had stored tools in it through the summer, a spare axe handle, the coil of hemp rope she used for the sled, 3 pounds of dried service berries in a sealed crock. She had never intended it as shelter. It faced the wrong direction for that. But the oak itself, the living mass of it, 4 feet through at the base, the root system gripping the north slope of the ridge like a fist, faced due south on its leeward side. And the leeward side of a 4-foot oak in the Palouse Hills wind was a different climate than 10 feet away in open grass. She had felt this in August without naming it, standing in the oak's shadow during a hot afternoon, noticing that the air against the trunk was still when everything around it moved. She stood at the base of the tree the morning after the surveyors left and looked at the leeward face. The bark was thick and furrowed, holding the previous day's sun in its ridges. The root mass on the south side had pushed the soil into a low natural berm, maybe 18 inches high, running 6 feet along the trunk base. The ground inside that berm was dry and dark, sheltered from the prevailing northwest wind by the trunk itself. Petra stood beside her, reading her grandmother's attention the way she had learned to read it over 2 years of working this claim together. "You're going to build against it," she said. "I'm going to build against it," Nessa confirmed. The 30-day clock meant she could not fight the railroad's resurvey in time to save the cabin. She had sent a letter to the land office attorney in Spokane Falls the same afternoon the surveyors left, riding the 6 miles to the Colfax postal rider's route herself and paying the postage from the coin she kept in the tallow tin. The letter was factual and precise. Dates, measurements, the original survey reference numbers she had copied from her filing documents, the name of the surveyor who had certified her claim in 1881. She had written it in the careful hand her father had taught her in Argyll, the hand of a person who understood that documents had weight. But she did not expect an answer in 30 days, and she did not plan around one. What she planned around was the oak. The structure she had in mind was not a cabin. It was not a dugout. It was a leaning frame, 4 ridge poles cut from the straightest lodgepole pine she could fell on the upper slope, each one 16 feet long and 4 inches through, set at a 40-degree angle against the south face of the oak trunk and staked into the berm at the base. The frame would carry a roof of overlapping sod blocks cut from the thick Palouse grass, each block 4 inches deep, the root mass intact, laid green and tight like shingles from the base up. The oak trunk formed the back wall. The sod roof shed rain and insulated against cold. At the berm at the base blocked ground-level wind. It was a variation of the black house her grandparents had built in Argyll, the Scottish turf-walled structure that had kept Highland families alive through winters that would have killed the unprepared. Her grandmother had built one after the clearances took their stone house, using whatever the land offered. Nessa had been 8 years old and had carried sod blocks until her arms gave out. She had never forgotten the logic of it. Thick walls, low profile, the earth itself as insulation. She explained none of this to Petra. She simply handed the girl the second axe and pointed at the lodgepole stand on the upper slope. They felled 4 poles the first day, limbed them clean, and dragged them down the slope using the sled and the rope from the oak cavity. Petra hauled without complaint, and her boot heels digging into the October grass, her breath coming hard and white in the cold air. She had her grandfather Alec's endurance, the kind that did not announce itself, but simply continued past the point where announcing seemed useful. The frame went up on the second day. Setting the pole bases into the berm required driving them through the root mass, which was dense and resistant, and turned the work from 2 hours into 5. Nessa used the iron-headed mattock for the first foot of each hole, then switched to the narrow spade for the final depth, working the tool in short, controlled strikes that preserved the angle. Each pole de base went in 2 feet deep, packed with the excavated soil, and tamped with the mattock handle until it held without flex when she pushed the top. She checked each one by leaning her full weight against the upper end. None moved. Petra cut sod on the slope above, while Nessa set poles, slicing blocks with the flat spade in a grid pattern, undercutting each block 4 inches down to keep the root mass intact. The Palouse grass sod was exceptional material, thick and bound and heavy with clay-rich soil that would dry to near hardness when it cured. Each block weighed roughly 12 pounds. Petra stacked them on the sled in rows of 8, dragged each load down to the oak, and set the blocks in the order Nessa called out. By the end of the 3rd day, the roof was half laid. The south-facing interior of the lean-to was already noticeably warmer than the open slope. Nessa pressed her palm flat against the oak trunk inside the frame and held it there. The bark was warm. The living wood behind it held 3 days of October sun in its mass, releasing it slowly into the still air the frame had created. The hollow cavity on the northeast face, the tool storage, the wrong-facing fire scar, now served a different purpose. She had packed it with the dried service berries, the spare rope, and the 3 remaining food crocks, sealed with the tallow she had finished rendering. The charred interior kept the temperature constant regardless of outside conditions. It was not a room. It was a cold larder, and it was better than any she could have built from scratch. On the fourth night, they slept inside the half-finished lean-to for the first time, wrapped in the wool blankets from the cabin, the sod roof above them dense and silent. The wind came hard from the northwest after midnight. Nessa lay on her back and listened to it move across the roof without finding a way in. The oak trunk at their heads did not shift or creak. It simply held, the way it had held for however many decades it had stood on that ridge, indifferent to the railroad and the surveyors and the 30-day clock and everything else that moved through human lives on the Palouse Hills. Petra was asleep before the wind peaked. Her breathing was slow and even. Nessa looked at the underside of the sea roof in the dark and thought about the attorney in Spokane Falls and the baseline measurement and the name of the surveyor who had certified her claim. She thought about her grandmother carrying saw blocks in Argyle after the clearances came. She thought about Alec, dead 12 years, who had said when they filed the claim, "The land doesn't know who owns it. Only the people standing on it do." The wind pushed against the sod roof and found nothing to grip. She closed her eyes. The 30 days ran out on a Tuesday. Nobody came. Nessa had expected someone, a railroad agent, a county sheriff with papers, the surveyor with his document case and his particular confidence. She had spent the final week of November watching the South Ridge from the lean-to entrance each morning while the frost hardened the grass and the Snake River Valley Road below disappeared under the first serious snowfall of the season. Nobody rode up that road. Nobody appeared on the ridge. The Northern Pacific Land Office in Spokane Falls had larger problems in November of 1883 than one woman and her granddaughter on a disputed section in the Palouse Hills. She did not relax. She noted the fact and continued working. The lean-to by then was finished in a way that the first week's construction had only approximated. She had added a second sod layer to the roof after the first snowfall showed her where the cold was pushing through. 2 thin spots near the ridgepole junctions where she had not packed the blocks tightly enough against the wood. She cut new blocks from the slope above, smaller this time, and pressed them into the gaps with her palms, working the clay-heavy soil into every space until the roof felt uniform under her hand. The second layer added 4 inches of insulation across the entire surface and brought the interior temperature up by a margin she measured the only way available to her, the behavior of her own breath. Inside the lean-to on a still night, her breath barely showed. Outside it hung like smoke. Petra had taken over the food management entirely by November, a responsibility she had assumed without being asked, which was the Scottish way of handling necessary work. You saw it, and you did it, and you didn't wait to be assigned. She kept a running inventory, scratched into a flat piece of pine bark with a nail, the marks grouped in 5s the way Nessa had taught her, updating it each morning after she checked the crocks in the oak cavity and the dried food stores hung in cloth bags from the lean-to ridgepole. She told Nessa the numbers each evening, the way a ship's officer reports to a captain, precise, without editorializing, trusting the listener to draw the correct conclusions. The numbers in November were adequate. The numbers in December were tight. Yet the elk tallow had stretched further than Nessa calculated, because Petra had discovered in late October that a thin smear of it on the interior sod walls slowed the moisture transfer that otherwise wicked heat out of the space. This was not something Nessa had taught her. The girl had worked it out by touching the walls on cold mornings and noticing which sections felt warmest, then reasoning backward to why. She had a systematic mind, inherited from nobody Nessa could specifically identify, which was perhaps the most useful kind. The letter from the Spokane Falls attorney arrived in December, carried by the postal rider who had begun stopping at the lean-to after Nessa left a note at the route marker explaining where she had relocated. The attorney's name was Harlan Mose. His letter was 4 pages, a dense with survey terminology and land grant precedent, and his conclusion was that the baseline error in the 1883 resurvey was documentable, but that contesting it would require a federal filing and would take 18 months at minimum, more likely 3 years. He listed his fee. It was substantial. Nessa read the letter twice by the light of the tallow lamp Petra had made from a hollowed river stone and a strip of cloth wick. Then she folded it and put it in the document pouch she kept dry inside the oak cavity wrapped in oilcloth. She did not discuss the fee with Petra because there was nothing to discuss. She did not have it. She had the claim, the lean-to, 8 crocks of preserved food, and the legal argument the attorney had outlined. 3 of those 4 things were useful right now. January came with the particular severity that Washington Territory reserves for years when the summer has been mild enough to make people careless. The temperature dropped below 0 on 6 consecutive nights in the 3rd week of the month. The Snake River Valley Road vanished completely under 4 feet of drifted snow and did not reappear until February. A family named Grisham on the section east of the disputed land lost their barn roof under the snow weight and lost 2 of their 3 milk cows to the cold that followed. The lean-to held, not because it was engineered beyond its materials. It was sod and lodgepole pine and the mass of 1 old oak, nothing more, but because Nessa had understood from the start that the structure's job was not to fight the cold. Its job was to use what the land already provided. The oak's thermal mass, and the berm's wind deflection, the sod's insulating depth, the northeast cavity's constant temperature for food storage. She had assembled these existing conditions into a system rather than imposing something foreign on the hillside, and the hillside had returned the favor by behaving as calculated. On the worst night, the 6th consecutive night below 0, Petra woke Nessa at 2 in the morning by touching her shoulder. Not in alarm. She simply wanted her grandmother to be awake for it, the sound the lean-to made in that cold, which was no sound at all. The wind had dropped and the sod had settled, and the oak held its stored warmth against their backs, and the silence was so complete it had a texture. They lay there for a while, listening to nothing. "Gran," Petra said. "Aye. We're going to win the filing." Nessa considered this. Outside the sod roof, the Palouse Hills held their January silence, white and vast and indifferent to railroads and survey errors, and the calculations of people trying to stay on land they had worked with their hands. "What makes you certain?" "Because Harlan Mose listed the precedents," Petra said. "I read the letter after you put it away. 3 of the 5 precedents ruled for the original claimant. The other 2 were thrown out on procedural grounds that don't apply to us." Nessa was quiet for a moment. "You read the attorney's letter. You left it in the pouch without the oilcloth retied. I thought it needed rewrapping." This was not entirely true, and they both understood it. Nessa said nothing. Outside, the temperature held below 0, and the oak held its warmth, and her granddaughter had read a 4-page legal document by tallow lamplight and extracted the relevant precedents without being asked, which was precisely the kind of person Nessa Cord was turning out to be. The federal filing went in by postal rider in March when the road cleared. Harlan Mose reduced his fee by 1/3 without explanation, which Nessa suspected meant he had looked more carefully at the precedents himself. The case moved through the federal land office in the slow, grinding way of institutional processes that have no particular urgency about them. It took 22 months. The ruling came in January of 1886. But the 1883 resurvey was invalidated on the grounds of a documented baseline measurement error, the same error Nessa had identified the afternoon the surveyor handed her the plat on the South Ridge. The original 1881 claim was reinstated. The Northern Pacific Land Office did not contest the ruling. They had larger problems by 1886, the kind that railroads accumulate when they have been making and unmaking survey errors across an entire territory for 5 years. Nessa rebuilt the cabin that spring on the same foundation as the original. Petra helped set the corner logs and cut the window frames. The lean-to they left standing against the oak's south face, not because they needed it, but because dismantling it felt wrong. It had done what it was asked to do, what it had held through a Washington Territory winter on sod and lodgepole and the thermal mass of one old tree, and it had held without failing. The oak still stood on the north end of the claim, still held its warmth in the bark on a still October afternoon, still gripped the Palouse hillside with its root mass like something that had decided long before either of them arrived that it was not moving. Some things hold simply because they are deep enough. If Nessa and Petra's story pulled you in, hit the like button. It tells us to keep these stories coming. Subscribe to Wild West Survival Tales so you never miss the next character fighting to stay alive on the frontier. Drop a comment below. Would you have stayed on that disputed land like Nessa did, or taken the 30 days and walked away? Because on this channel, the next survivor is already waiting.